What most people don't realize is even during deep sleep, there's DNA repair. We get deeper into the cell at that point. So obviously vital in terms of cancer. Also during deep sleep, again, something that affects cancer as well as infectious disease, your immune system is treated during deep sleep. Absolutely vital, as well as your endocrine system. So all of these things get tremendous levels of attention during that stage of sleep.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have Dan Cohen on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to a neurologist and someone who understands sleep, especially when it comes to the brain of a menopausal woman. And so much is changing, so much is going on. But before we dive into that and understanding it better, why don't you share with us how and why you even got into the world of sleep?
I got into medicine first simply because I was really interested in mind versus brain. I had read a lot about different philosophies and psychological issues, and that became my passion. After becoming an MD and then a neurologist, so that I could really understand the brain itself, I ended up starting a business instead of practicing simply because in neurology, back then, around 1980, there weren't a lot of good treatments for things. And I didn't want to just diagnose people and say, sorry, can't help you.
Yeah.
So I went into business to create neurologic devices. And so we created the first automated brainwave monitor to help prevent strokes during high risk surgery. And then the same technology, we realized we could use this in the new field of sleep because sleep medicine was really just getting going in the early 80s. There were only 300 sleep labs globally. And so we looked at that and we said, this is going to be a growing area. And we've got technology that can basically make it a lot easier for them to do more sleep studies. Because back then, they would record on a traditional EEG machine and all the different parameters. And in a whole night, you generate essentially half a mile of paper. And then, right, it's a lot of paper. And the technician the next day had to go page by page and score it. They had to stage the sleep, look for respiratory events, any EKG abnormalities, all of that. And every page had to be scored in that way. And it was taking them 4 to 6 hours to do it.
Wow.
And I was friendly with a doc who had a sleep lab. And I went in there and I looked at the stuff and I said, we can automate this process. And he didn't believe me, but he says, okay, you can use my lab and try. I said, no problem. Over the course of a year, we developed the technology. And after 6 years, we had that 4 to 6 hours down to 1 minute.
Wow.
Right.
How did you do that?
I was interested in math and science, and I could program a computer as well. I wrote the algorithms that took in the signal, you converted it to a digital signal, and then you applied different mathematical algorithms to simplify it and draw certain curves. And based on statistics, it was not hard to figure out, all right, if this is happening, that's happening. It's this stage of sleep. Look at respiratory events, desaturations, all of those things. So essentially, it wasn't that difficult a task to do. And after 10 years, there were 3,000 instead of 300 sleep labs, most of which were using our equipment.
Incredible. That's
Yeah.
incredible. And it's crazy to think how few, you said globally 300 labs. That's not a lot. That doesn't show how important sleep is. But now I think it's at the forefront of everything. We know how important it is to get good sleep. So you fell into a good sector, I think, that's absolutely booming now, and everybody's trying to get good sleep. And when we go through this perimenopause to menopause transition, it's so elusive, it's so hard, and a lot has to do with the loss of our hormones and getting some hot flashes and everything. So I would love to know, as a neurologist, what did you find? Did you study back then? I doubt it, menopausal women, but any information you have on what happens to a brain and during this menopause transition?
In medical school, you do learn some things, but it was not a specific area of my study. What happened in my case was after developing the equipment that we developed for sleep, and then we actually moved into consumer products and we launched the what became the Breathe Right nasal strip.
Oh
And
yeah,
so
that's
and
correct.
so
That's crazy.
ultimately we sold that business. And one of the things that really had bothered me when I went to medical school was stress. And the fact that we were taught that 75 to 90% of all medical conditions are either caused by or made worse by chronic stress. And so I would ask my professors, why aren't we treating that like a primary pathology? And first of all, so many people have chronic stress, but around menopause, it can be exaggerated. All right.
Absolutely.
And so that became a real issue, but an issue across the board. And so I wanted to see if we could develop some technology that would essentially treat that in a safe, non-invasive fashion. And so it was back to studying the brain again in terms of how do we stimulate what is considered to be the rest and digest portion of the autonomic or automatic nervous system, that primitive part of the nervous system that regulates the function of so many of our organs, pretty much all of our organs in one way or another. And as in perimenopausal and menopausal women, things get a little out of whack, particularly with what happens in the hypothalamus that regulates all the hormones. And sleep plays a critical role in rebalancing those factors during the night to help you the next day. But again, all those factors are significantly impacted during that period in a woman's life.
Everything is changed by stress. It's incredible how many people I've interviewed, and no matter what, even if they're selling something or whatever, they say it all boils down. Whatever supplement isn't going to save the world, because if you're stressed, that's going to make the biggest impact. So it always comes down to stress. And I really like that you're understanding them both and how they both could go together, because you can't get good sleep if you're stressed out, right? It's just impossible. So in the end, yeah, we have to deal with this stress, try to get good sleep, but we need to sleep every night. So in the meantime, we got to do what we can to regulate the brain, lower our stress in order to get the good sleep. So in terms of then through when we are sleep deprived, and whether it's a woman or a man or menopause, no menopause, doesn't matter. Let's dive a little bit into why it's so crucial for us to get good sleep.
It's important to realize that there are different stages of sleep. And some of those stages are much more important than others. Now, for instance, one of the stages of sleep is drowsiness. Would you consider drowsiness to be pivotal for your health? Probably not, right? Okay. On the other hand, probably the most important stage of sleep is deep sleep, which is also called delta sleep because that ultimately produces delta brainwaves, really slow brainwaves. And so that stage of sleep is also called slow wave sleep because of the slow waves. But what confuses a lot of people is they say if we're measuring all this stuff from the head in terms of sleep, like in a sleep lab, you want to look at the brainwaves as one thing. Everybody thinks that sleep is generated from the surface of the cerebrum, the cortex, and it's not. That's a manifestation of what's happening underneath it. So it's really the primitive part of the brain. What surprises most people is reptiles sleep, and they don't have a cerebrum. They don't have cerebral cortex.
Oh, and I guess, yeah, it must not be because of the cerebral cortex. It's probably the stem, or I don't know, you said
Right.
the
And it's the autonomic nervous system, which actually began to evolve about 500 million years ago. When fish started to develop organs, there needed to be a way to regulate those organs. And that's why part of this part of the nervous system really evolved to do that. Okay, so that you don't have to think about regulating your kidneys or your liver. I mean, you ever think about that? Oh,
no.
wait a minute. I got to send this wire down there, this electrical stimulus to produce this particular chemical. Obviously, nobody does that. All right. So all of this is automatic. And this part of the nervous system had to develop that capability. And so the pacemaker of the different stages of sleep resides in this very primitive part, which is at the base of the brain in the middle. Okay. And then from that, the rest of the brain evolved. But even in that area, I'm sure your listeners may have heard of the phrase fight or flight in relationship to stress. That's one division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. And that's one of the primitive divisions simply because it's necessary for our survival. A lot of times people think that this sympathetic division that gives you fight or flight is bad, but yet it's pivotal for our survival. But what you don't want is you don't want that to be active all day long. That leads to chronic stress. Now, the counterbalance is the parasympathetic division, which really has to do with resting, taking it easy, digesting your food, all the opposites versus fight or flight. Your blood pressure goes down, your temperature actually goes down. So all of these things are happening during that stage in terms of operating in parasympathetic mode. And the best way to think about this is think about a seesaw. When one side is up, the other is down. So when you're in fight or flight and your sympathetic is up, your parasympathetic is down, and parasympathetic really leads to health, curing the body, physical restoration, and vice versa. When parasympathetic is high, stress goes away because you're not in fight or flight mode. And that's really important when it comes to different stages of sleep, because when you really look at deep sleep, the parasympathetic division is very active. So the pacemaker for that stage of sleep, deep sleep, and even light sleep, because light sleep is a very broad area, and it's not dream sleep, which is called REM. And the two are very different. If you want to look at sleep stages, the best way to do it is divide REM sleep, dream sleep, from non-REM, which is light and deep, right? And so parasympathetic, very active in basically non-REM sleep, deep sleep. And that's really what you want.
So the deep sleep, as I understand, is when we have rejuvenation, repair. This is why it's so necessary, because we do so much damage throughout the day, but even just breathing does damage. Just being human, that's the way it is. So we do need our sleep. And it's like crazy how much we deprive ourselves willingly because of work or stress and things and phones and light and all these things. So it's really important to, we always say, prioritize sleep. But even so, a lot of women are having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, or they're waking up early, or they find it hard to fall asleep again when they go to bed. I'm wondering, though, we always say deep sleep is the most important, but I understand that REM is also pretty important. I think the two have their different functions, but I'm less familiar with REM other than it's that dream state, rapid eye movement. Is there, what else is going on in the body during that REM sleep?
It's good that you bring this up because REM is actually the second most important stage. Okay. Think about REM sleep as being your personal therapist. And dreams are all about you. You might dream about somebody else, but that's just a representation of an aspect of you.
Yeah.
Right? And so usually the events during the day get played out at night in your sleep. And if there was something that's bothering you related to those events, there usually will be activity in the brain related to those events. And different aspects of those events are stored in memory. And there are different relationships in memory between that event and what you remember about those things and your attitudes and beliefs. So all of that plays out in what's called the limbic system of the brain, your hippocampus for memories, and all these other centers that relate to emotional responses and reactivity. Okay, because we all have coping strategies, defense mechanisms, and all of that stuff comes into play during REM sleep, as well as memory, again, because of those relationships.
So then that would affect anyways how you're going throughout the day as well. Sometimes we solve problems in our dreams, right? Or you can remember them. It's that dealing with whatever it is happened during the day. Even I've noticed if I may have a dream of something that I literally was looking at just before I went to sleep, or if it was the news, or if it was a message, or I don't know if I'm studying something, right? When I was doing my gerontology, I was studying all the time. And right before I went to bed, I felt like during the night, I would even solve problems from my homework in the middle of the night. So I guess it's important what you look at right before you go to bed.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things I do routinely is I try to use my brain not to think of the answer, but instead to form the question. And
Oh.
so a lot of times I'm working on something. And so I think I don't understand this. And so I work on figuring out the question. And then oftentimes I'll wake up in the morning with the answer.
So is there, we all seem to have, at least in this biohacking community, we have gadgets and devices and wearables tracking our sleep. And so I think a lot of people now are familiar with their deep sleep scores and their REM sleep scores. I mean, that's the two that we focus on. And we may sometimes focus on how much time we're awake and get stressed out about that. But so I understood, so I interviewed a sleep expert one time, and she said that when you have these devices, you want to shoot for minimum 20% of deep and 20% REM. Does that coincide with any of the research you've done?
Yeah, 20% is on the low end if you're looking at total sleep time versus time in bed. Okay.
Mm,
But
mm.
her number may be perfect if she is referring to time in bed. Okay. Because remember, if you're in bed for 8 hours, let's say, there's a good chance during that 8 hour time period, you're up an hour in terms of the time it takes you to fall asleep and then wake during sleep,
Hmm.
right? So again, that alters that percentage from, let's say, 25 down to 20. I like to use the 25% of the time you're in sleep, that you're actually asleep,
Ah.
right? But again, that's a little that doesn't really matter that much. But what's important though to think about is that over your lifespan, the amount of time you spend in dream sleep is pretty constant. Okay, provided your total duration of sleep doesn't change too dramatically. Stanford University did an excellent review article on what happens over your lifespan. Right? They took all the data from the different sleep studies that measured how much sleep, how much type of sleep, the different sleep stages that people had at different ages in terms of duration. And they measured ages from 5 to 85.
Mm.
Okay, so it was a very complete study. And what they found is that a typical 5-year-old would sleep about 9 hours, and a typical 85-year-old would sleep 5 hours and 20 minutes. So
Mm.
you lose 3 hours and 40 minutes of sleep. Okay, so think about that for a second. And then realize that dream sleep, for instance, typically happens in the last half of your night. And if your night is getting shorter and shorter, you may lose some of that dream sleep. Now, having said that, if you lose too much, there'll be more of it that occurs earlier in the night. And usually that balances things out. And so over a lifespan, you generally don't lose that much dream sleep. However, deep sleep occurs earlier in the night, but we lose enough brain circuits as we get older for deep sleep to drop off. And that's the one that really drops off a lot. We like to look at, for adults, ideal normal sleep, which is like when you're 18 to 20.
Mhm.
Okay. And somebody who's that age typically will get about an hour and 45 minutes of deep sleep.
I thought it would be more than that.
When you're younger, when you're a small child and you're really growing, then yes, it
Once you
is.
hit teenage 20s, 20
You know,
year
you
olds.
right. You're not really growing at that point.
No.
Because in
Yeah.
deep sleep, one of the most important endocrine functions is growth hormone, and 70% of that is released during that deep sleep period.
Hmm.
Okay, so you really have to put out a lot of growth hormone during that point. But when you're older, you don't need as much growth hormone.
What if you're training really hard, like you're a bodybuilder
Um,
or something? Then you need
you
probably more sleep,
will
or athlete.
exercise will promote more deep sleep and more growth hormone. Okay, so your activities do matter. When we talk about older individuals, that's a very big factor. It's stay moving and stay active. Okay, for that very reason. Because you would ask the questions, what are the other benefits of deep sleep? And you mentioned the rejuvenative capability of that and cell repair and literally cell growth. Okay, so there's cell replacement. What most people don't realize is even during deep sleep, there's DNA repair. Okay, so we get deeper into the cell at that point. Obviously, vital in terms of cancer, for instance. Also, during deep sleep, again, something that affects cancer as well as infectious disease, your immune system is treated during deep sleep. Absolutely vital, as well as your endocrine system. So all of these things get tremendous levels of attention during that stage of sleep. In addition, there's a lot of washout of bad chemicals in the brain and nervous system during that. There's some controversy as to which chemicals might affect Alzheimer's disease and the like. So there's obviously missing knowledge. We got a lot to learn about these kinds of things. But if you think about using that deep sleep period to clean out stuff that you don't want in your brain, that's a good thing. Unfortunately, that hour and 45 minutes that you might get when you're 20, by the time you're 80, you might have none, or best case 20 minutes.
I think our audience has heard of the glymphatic system and how the brain, we call it brain shampoo. It washes out while we're sleeping. Does that happen only in deep sleep, or does that happen other stages?
It happens more in deep sleep. Here's one of the confusing parts. And this was my argument with the Sleep Society back in the 80s. When we pioneered the automation, when I looked at it, I said, folks, we can really enhance the way you're looking at sleep because 50% of your sleep time is light sleep. But what is light sleep? Light sleep is everything from drowsiness to deep sleep. So it's a huge spectrum of activity.
Oh, it includes the deep sleep part? The light sleep includes
No, it's
up
like, but
to.
it's quarters on it, or up to, right? So if you think about it, let's say your deep sleep or your light sleep, you might have light sleep that is almost deep sleep. Okay. I might have light sleep that is just a little bit better than drowsiness. And that's 50% of our night. So your sleep could be vastly better, but yet we both have the same score in terms of the amount of light sleep.
Yeah. So how do we measure that?
What we've done is in our wearable, we looked at that and we said, this is ridiculous. It's time to fix this. And
Yes.
so we look at what's called non-REM quality, because remember, non-REM is light sleep and deep sleep. So we also look at deep sleep separately and we give all these metrics, but we also look at the whole spectrum of non-REM sleep and see how deep is your total non-REM sleep, which is a better metric because what's defined as deep sleep is just somebody said, we should just have this cutoff. So if 20% of this 30-second period, another 6 seconds, have delta brainwaves in it, then we're going to call it deep sleep. But if it has 5 seconds rather than 6 seconds, we're just going to call it light sleep. Well, that's just an arbitrary cutoff.
Yeah.
See what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah.
That's the problem. So we said, so I wanted to automate that differently back in the 80s. And they said, no, that's not what we want. Because in 1967, these sleep stages were defined. And so we're just going to maintain that.
How ridiculous. So then with your system, then you've differentiated that as non-REM sleep. And so that you've figured out which one is closer to the deep and which one is closer to the actual REM. And then you quantify that. And that is part of the algorithm to give you a score. Is that correct?
Now, that's right. Now, we also give you the amount of delta sleep, but one of the main scores that we provide is called depth. Okay, and it's depth of non-REM sleep. And that one's a truer representation of how deep your sleep is.
So for example, somebody gets a deep sleep number, I guess you would say minutes, or let's say they have an hour of deep sleep, but yet their depth score is different. And that would be, I don't know, in number of minutes or hours, because I haven't checked. I haven't noticed that or looked at so much of that difference on the app yet.
If you have, let's say, an hour of deep sleep, but you also have a lot of deep light sleep, okay, or deeper light sleep.
Yes, you're closer to the deep sleep in that light sleep stage, yeah.
Then your depth score will be higher than your delta score.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's like an add-on. It's like you got an hour, but then you got an hour add-on because you were pretty close. Not exactly deep, but close.
Right. And then the other thing we do is we say, to make this really understandable across different people, different ages, we don't just say, okay, you know, you're this way, and we're just going to compare you to your baseline period. Okay, because that really doesn't help you understand how your sleep is versus ideal. Okay, so we take all your scores and we say, all right, you might have an hour of sleep, of deep sleep, but if you were 19, you should have an hour and 45 minutes. So your delta score is really related to how much you should have when you're younger. All
Mhm.
right. So we want to make it more aspirational and say, okay, I might have had a score of 70, even though I had an hour of deep sleep, but that's not nearly, if I had to get 100, I need to have a sleep like I'm 19.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So there's a common scale for everybody. So they know where they're at.
This is why I go back to the percentage, because especially when I was studying, doing my gerontology course, it was in LA and I was in Spain, and I had to get up at 2 a.m. and or stay up late at night. I had crazy hours of sleep, but so sometimes I would have very short sleep, but I still got an hour of deep or whatever I had normally, hour and a half. You normally get about an hour and a half is generally my score, between 1.5 to 2, but I still got that 1 hour and a half of sleep despite. And so then of course my percentage was
Way
fabulous.
up.
But so then I'm wondering, did I just hack my sleep? Is that still okay? Even though I slept only 6 hours, but still managed to get the hour and a half of deep sleep. So this is why I'm going back to the percent. I'm thinking, oh, maybe percentage is better, but maybe not. I don't know. What do you think?
Going back to what I said earlier, if you get most of your deep sleep early in the night. So if you sleep less, but you still have this chunk of time that's early in the night, there's enough time in there to get your deep sleep. All right. However, having said that, the total amount of sleep is important. Okay. And this has been demonstrated many times with very substantial longitudinal studies that looked at people's amount of sleep over decades. So these were long term studies. And when you add them all up, you're probably dealing with hundreds of thousands of people. Now, remember, they were measuring the amount of sleep time. These people didn't sleep in 30 years in a sleep lab. Okay.
No, no, yeah,
So, and they didn't have wearables then either. So all of this was self report. If somebody went to bed at 11 o'clock and woke up at 7 o'clock, they would say they slept 8 hours. Okay.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and what I said earlier is probably you slept 7 hours, not 8 hours, because you took your time to fall asleep and then you had wake after sleep onset. What the studies revealed, however, was you probably need about 6 hours of sleep. But again, the way those sleep studies were done, self report, if you subtract an hour of that, maybe 5 hours is good enough for some people. However, there are some people who demand a lot more sleep. I
yeah.
mean, the typical range is anywhere from typically 6 to 9 hours. And when you look at it, and what they found in these longitudinal studies was that if you slept less than 6 hours, again, that's probably time in bed, but if you were in bed less than 6 hours, your incidence of Alzheimer's disease, cancer, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, all of those things were dramatically higher. So, in those people, even if they had enough deep sleep, and maybe they didn't, they probably didn't have enough anyway, because as you lose that as you get older, but still, that shorter period of time was correlated with a significant increase in those severe diseases.
And it has probably something to do maybe with the gut, like you said, or the immune system. And when you're deprived of sleep, and I would see that when I was especially a young mom, and I would have, maybe if I slept more than 4 nights at 6 hours, I got sick. I got a cold like on day 4 or 5. Like I knew I couldn't push it. And it just was, I could see it, repetitive. And that's when I was young and you're healthy and everything. So the older you get, and then you're more sleep deprived, and then your immune system is more compromised. You can imagine. And even in my gerontology course, I did some research for a project I did, and I wanted to look into sleep and menopause and then diseases, all kinds of diseases of aging. But I had to literally research this myself, and I kept actually asking my professors, why aren't we studying enough about sleep? Like we just barely graze the surface. If it's that impactful on how we are getting diseases, when we're getting diseases, and if we get disease, then it's something to look at. And then when you look at the menopausal woman who's totally like more sleep deprived than most people at that period of time, why are we looking at menopause? So I think, and this is USC, like one of the best gerontology institutes in the world. And I just, I hopefully I've changed their curriculum a little bit by stamping my feet a little bit, saying we need to look at sleep, please. It's so important. I knew this back then, but I want to talk a little bit about the Soltec device that you created. And before we do that, I don't think if I saw on the app the HRV score. I don't think that's something you look into, or did I miss it?
Well, it's the HRV score is in itself meaningless.
No, really?
I have no idea.
I don't have to worry about it anymore.
Here's the deal. I might get a little too technical here. Bear with me. HRV means heart rate variability.
Yes.
Okay. So in other words, from one beat to the next beat, there's a time period. And so the way it's calculated is, do those time periods between beats change? How much do they change? And as you know, there's something called sinus arrhythmia, where just with breathing, there's this fluctuation. All right. The reason heart rate variability is monitored to try to understand sleep and stress but let's talk about sleep first, is that in the different stages of sleep, there's a very small difference in heart rate variability. So the deeper your sleep, the less variable it is, or the more constant it is. Okay. So in deep sleep, you have the greatest constancy from beat to beat. And it's because your breathing tends to be a little bit more shallow. Sometimes your heart rate will often go up a little bit. And so you've got this nice constancy to help, like you said, the lymphatic system wash things out. And because your respiratory rate may be a little lower, then during that time, you need enough oxygen supply, so your heart rate will go a little faster. Again, it depends on the individual. But when you look at heart rate variability, that's what you're measuring. And it's measured basically as an aid to try to stage sleep. But here's what we discovered. And when we developed our technology, I was interested in developing the therapy. Okay. I figured that once we developed the therapy, I would go to one of the wearable companies and say, hey guys, I want to use your wearable to run our magnetic generator. And so after we developed the therapy, I called one of them up and I said, hey, I want to do this with you. And they said, fascinating project. We'd love to do it, but we can't. So why not? They said, what you're asking for is too difficult for us to do because we have to preserve battery life, and the level of calculations you want to do is much greater than what we do. I said, really? I said, what do you do? And they said, we look at the heart rate variability in what's called the time domain. In other words, they looked at all those segments of time, and they only gave you a standard deviation of the time difference. And I said, no, I need that information in the frequency domain. And that involves many more calculations. And therefore, the microprocessor gets used a lot more, and that reduces battery life.
Oh, wow.
Charging. So I said, all right, you know what? We'll do it ourselves. We'll make our own wearable because I need time and frequency domain heart rate variability. Because what we had discovered was, remember how I talked about the pacemakers of sleep are in the brainstem, but yet the manifestation is in the cortex that they measure using EEG. Well, when you look at heart rate variability in the frequency domain, you're actually measuring what's happening at the brainstem level.
Really?
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, okay. How?
All
But
right.
you've got these devices on the cortex area and the upper part of the brain. So how?
Because you're measuring, remember, this same part of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, regulates heart rate. Okay. And heart rate variability, when measured in the frequency domain, is especially the metric we developed. We had to develop our own metric because what had been used by medicine in the past was a very crude metric.
Mhm.
All right. And it didn't take into account some of the stuff you and I've discussed previously about levels of anxiety. All right. And so they were looking at it in a very gross manner, even when they looked at the frequency domain. And so when I tested that versus the studies that had been out there, all the studies were done on normal people, young, healthy adults. I said, wait a minute, we're making this product for people that are not young and healthy. They're not going to have the same results. And sure enough, they didn't. And I found tremendous gaps. And I said, I can't use these metrics. And so I had to develop our own metrics that reflected heart rate variability in the frequency domain across all individuals that can be compared to young, healthy adults.
Yeah,
All right.
bravo. Yeah, it makes perfect
Okay.
sense.
Right. And so we developed our own. And what we found is that related very nicely to what was happening at the brainstem level. And the reason we knew that is there was a study done in France by Gabrielle Brandenberger, and her team. And what they did is they measured heart rate variability versus brainwaves. Okay. And they correlated the two in terms of how heart rate variability reflects deep sleep, delta waves, and then the actual timing of the delta waves.
Mhm.
Right. And what she found is there's a beautiful correlation between, okay, when the heart rate variability goes down, there's a nice increase in delta brain waves. But there was a lag time. In other words, heart rate variability, when you look at it, the onset of it, that happens 5 minutes before you get the delta brain waves.
Oh gosh. Yes.
Okay. It's
Yes.
because remember, this is all the pacemaker is down in the brainstem. That also sends out the signals to the heart. And so you get the heart rate changes before all the circuitry that you have to go through to create delta waves occurs. Because there's a lot of circuitry between the pacemaker and then the actual brain waves, the delta brain waves. And when she measured it, and it was 5 minutes. And that study was published in 2001 and then replicated in 2003 and 2005.
It's
Okay.
crazy because the brain fires things in such a fast moment. I want to move my finger, and my brain sends the signal to the finger. But 5 minutes between the HRV pace and then what the signal in the brain to me seems way too long.
It does. I couldn't believe it either. But then I'm a neurologist. And so I looked at the circuitry and I said, I get why it takes that long because the this automatic or autonomic nervous system sits in what's called the reticular activating system above the pons, right? And the northbound signal goes up to the reticular nucleus of the thalamus, okay? And that doesn't go right to the cortex, okay? That nucleus sends its fibers only to all the 20 different nuclei in the thalamus, and it coordinates all of those. And then each of those have what's called thalamocortical loops to a part of the cortex. And all of that coordination, because delta brainwaves start out front of the head and move to the back of the head. So that all of that coordination takes that 5 minutes.
Wow. Wow. Just to remind people, the delta waves is the deep sleep waves. That's the good stuff. That's
Right.
what we want.
Right.
Incredible.
So what we found was the cortex influences heart rate variability when you look at the standard deviation or the time domain analysis. So as we were looking at these two tracings that we developed, you saw that there's a difference in time, number one. Okay. But not only that, is if you've got some anxiety or stress, that time-based analysis doesn't go as low. So you have a much smaller range, and therefore to try to figure out what's delta versus what's not delta is much harder.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the frequency-based analysis is much broader, so you see a much clearer differentiation.
Mm.
And that's why we said, hey, you know what? We knew because we rely on frequency information to send signals to our generator, which produces frequencies. So we had to know how these people are operating throughout the night to give them what we call real-time sleep stage enhancement. Our wearable, what you're wearing right now on your wrist, that wearable, which by the way, users only need to use it at night. They don't have to wear it during the day. That wearable actually tracks your sleep and analyzes your sleep stage in real time. And then as you're moving into deep sleep, it sends, and only takes a fraction of a second, it sends a signal to the generator under the bed saying, okay, she's moving into deep sleep. And then it puts out this frequency specific to you because it already has done a calibration to support deep sleep. And then once you're in deep sleep, and that's to support the really primitive part of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then once you're in deep sleep, it said, okay, she made it down into this deep sleep. Now we're going to send another signal that the language of the nervous system is frequencies. So it's going to send another signal to tell the generator to produce frequencies that affect the thalamus. Okay. To deepen that to deep delta sleep.
Yeah.
Okay. And that occurs to really deepen your sleep over time.
So let's explain a little bit what this generator that you're talking about looks like and what we're talking about. And we're talking about the Soltech system. And this is a device that I've been using. It's only 3 days, so I'm still in the calibration phase, but it's this block, I don't know, just like the size of, I don't know, a tray for carrying food or something, but it's quite heavy in this. You can carry it up and down without a problem. But I put it underneath the bed when I want to measure my sleep, but also it activates in using a magnetic field of some kind, which you can explain, in order to send me these frequencies, like you said, to my body and eventually to my brain to guide me into sleep. And the way I understand it, it's not like masking you or you are trying to manipulate you to sleep, but it's actually just sort of a guide on where you're at and enhancing that. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. This device has 2 magnets in it. And to get the frequencies we want, each magnet is attached to a motor. And we spin the magnet the frequency we need to, which is very low. Okay. We're talking about it might take 4 seconds to make a whole revolution. All right. So it doesn't make any noise, but it does produce a magnetic frequency. And then for, let's say, moving into deep sleep, that frequency in a person who's functioning very normally might be 0.25 hertz. In other words, it takes 4 seconds for that to go around. Somebody who has PTSD, it might be even slower than that. It may be, instead of 4 seconds, it might take 7 seconds to go around because they operate at a lower frequency. And that's why you're going through the calibration period to figure out what works for you. And then that continues over time to really refine it further. But that generator produces these waves, and we tell people if it can fit under the bed, put it down around under where your ankles would be, roughly. If it doesn't fit under the bed, put it on the floor by the footboard. Okay, because it has a radius of activity of about 4 or 5 feet. Mm-hmm. So it's going to influence the frequencies around you. And the frequencies that it generates, it not only travels up the nerves, ultimately getting to the brain, but you may have heard of what NIH calls the biofield. The sort of the electromagnetic field that.
Oh, yeah, we know the EMF.
Yeah. But the person has their own biofield.
Ah, okay.
Eastern medicine, it would be called chi or ki or prana. Okay. Well, in 1991, the NIH formed what was called the Division of, or the Office of Alternative Health. Ultimately, it became functional medicine. All right. So they brought in experts that were familiar with Eastern and Western medicine, and they defined what they, in 1993, coined as the biofield. Okay.
Oh, okay. So this is our own body's magnetic field.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. After all, humans evolved on the Earth, which has a magnetic field. So it's not surprising that can interact with the nervous system. So it's not surprising that our nervous system operates in that way. So what we're doing, and you said the right word when you said enhancement, okay? Because we're tracking what stage of sleep you're in or moving into. And so we want to support that stage of sleep. So even, let's say you're an older individual and you've lost most of your delta sleep, we still know when your brain wants to go into delta sleep. All right. So what we do is we say, okay, she wants to go into delta sleep. Let's support what she wants, what her brain wants to do. And so we put out the frequency that will support that stage of sleep. Now, let's say that person has lost the northbound circuitry in the thalamus or the cortex, which we lose as we age, right? And that's why we lose deep sleep as we age. There's such a thing called neuroplasticity. So if your brain's getting this stimulus over time, those nerves will regrow. And therefore, this delta sleep or deep sleep can be restored. And we've watched that happen. When I started this out, I was in my mid 60s and I was down to 20 minutes a night. I was one of those that lost my deep sleep relatively early. And now on average, I get an hour and a half. So from 20 minutes to 90 minutes.
Right. And you must feel a difference too yourself and your energy,
yeah.
the brain, how it thinks.
Right. I was using 3-4 cups of coffee a day and frequently taking naps. Now I don't have any caffeine and I don't take naps, but I meditate. So that's a little different. But I meditate in the morning when I wake up. So I don't need it in the afternoon, for instance.
Yeah.
So there's a dramatic difference. But again, when you look at age, even as we talked about, mid to late 40s, you've already lost 60 to 70% of your deep sleep. So it really impacts people younger than they thought. I was talking to a football player about a month ago, and he said, he says, you know what? Because he saw the curve of how much you lose. He goes, that's true. He said, I was so much better when I was in my 20s as opposed to my early 30s. So he was a finely tuned athlete. He was a Pro Bowler. And he realized that just that age difference was enough to reduce his deep sleep and his performance. So he said, why didn't you develop this 20 years earlier? I could have used this in my career. So it's vital for health and performance.
The question I have about the device itself. So it works on through magnetic technology, the way I understand. And I remember my father, like 30 years ago, he was wearing a band when there was some magnets, I don't know, for healing or whatever he was doing. I don't know if it's the same, but evidently there is a world of magnets and healing. But one of my first question was, before I got the device was, I got a total hip replacement. I got a piece of metal in me. Am I going to suck myself to the machine? Is this bad? Like, are there any contraindications, people who shouldn't be doing this, risks to using a device like that?
You're getting into a legal question now, so I'm gonna be very straightforward and ask and tell you exactly what labeling we have on the packaging. Okay, but first let me tell you, the magnetic field that you're exposed to with this technology is not any stronger than the magnetic field of the Earth. And the magnetic field of the Earth also produces these frequencies. So it would sort of make sense that there's no damage that can be done by this because you're already being exposed to it by the Earth. If you want to escape that, you got to go to Mars or something.
Yeah.
All right. But because we live in a litigious society, and this is a new product, our legal representative said, look, because this is a product and you're just introducing it, you got to put all the standard warnings on there. So we literally have on our labeling, if you have an implantable device, typically an electronic device, not what you have, or pregnancy, or if you're under 18, because we did no testing on children, then you should just say, it's not for use in these individuals. So that's what our labeling says. But again, it's more for legal coverage.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I understand that. Okay. If it's no more than what the Earth produces, then what makes it better than the Earth? Because if you've harnessed it or localized it, or what's the difference?
No, the Earth doesn't put out the frequencies that we put out in the same concentration. And it's a mixed frequency. So we're giving you the frequencies that support that aspect of the brain that is producing that stimulus. Okay, it's called entrainment. So it's like having two tuning forks that are tuned to the same frequency. And if you start one and you just bring it closer to the other, you don't have to touch the other, it starts to vibrate. The same kind of thing happens here. It's a different mechanism. Here with the tuning forks, it's just vibration of the air molecules. Okay. With what we're doing, it goes through other nerves or it goes through this biofield to basically cause the movement of sodium and potassium that make it more rhythmic and support the sodium potassium pump between the glial system and the neurons to facilitate movement of those nerves that normally operate at those frequencies. And so we know what nerves, parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, we know what frequencies they operate at. And again, we do the calibration to fine tune that. So those are the frequencies we produce to entrain that area of the nervous system to be more active when it's supposed to be more active.
Mm. When I use the device, so there's a 5 day of calibration. And then after that, there's an entrainment phase where we try to support the deep sleep. And we should, and actually, as I understand, the neurons in the brain actually, because it's plastic, it will eventually over time change for the better. I've used this only 3 days. And I remember my first experience was I remember waking up, but barely, and I fell asleep in 2 seconds. And when I went to pee and I came back and I could barely remember it. The second night, I swear to God, I think I did, but I couldn't remember it. So I was really shocked. And it usually takes me a couple of minutes to fall asleep unless something's on my mind, and it can happen. I have 30 minutes or an hour and like, oh my God. So I haven't had that experience yet. I would love to see, but maybe I'll never because I'm using this device. But I was really shocked at how quickly, how fast, how I fell asleep. And that was only the very beginning. So I imagine over time, I'm going to experience, at least I shouldn't see my scores through the wearable. So I'm wearing there's a watch-like device that you wear only when you're sleeping. And I have it now because I was using it for the stress mode, because you have another stress mode that we can use during the day, and trying to get understanding of how this is. But I do feel also some tingling, but oddly enough, it's in one leg, on my operated leg. And I don't know why. And I think I remember you explaining, is that a sign that you're tapping into the vagus nerve or the nervous system? What does that mean?
The tingling is interesting in that it's something that we ask people to try to encourage. Okay. This is actually a really important point. Let's do a little experiment right here. Take your hands and put them up like this. All right. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to focus on the palmar aspect of your hands and fingers. All right. You just shut your eyes for a second and just feel that area of your body, just the palmar aspect of your hands and fingers. And what do you feel?
I feel tingling in my right. And also now my left.
Okay. So now you feel it on both hands. All
Yeah.
right. Okay. Now try to intensify that feeling.
Yeah. You can do it.
Right. Okay.
So like a feeling of fullness as well.
Yes. Yes. Or some people describe it as tingling and heaviness. Yes.
Yeah. Energy. Yeah. You're
Yeah.
focusing on that part of the body.
Okay. All right. End of experiment. All right. Now, you mentioned the word energy, right? We had a third party do an experiment where we were interested in the interaction between the magnetic frequencies we were using and this thing called the biofield. And there were measurable differences that he saw at the frequencies we were using. And they were very significant in terms of the amount of change. And what you're feeling there is your own biofield. interacting with your neurons, because that's what happens. Actually, the biofield interacts with what are called glial cells, the myelin sheath, all right, and which then interacts with the neuron. And so your sensory receptors are becoming active and feeling that. Now, different people have different capabilities in terms of being able to feel that. Women are at a great advantage because their feeling nature is typically greater than men's. And the reason for that in most societies is that men have to portray this image of manliness, and I'm not going to be swayed by emotions as much. I'm more rational. It's a cultural and gender bias that exists. Whereas it's okay for a woman to be more heart centered and have a greater feeling nature. I don't have to explain this to anybody. Everybody knows this is the way society is. All right. And I was a great example of a guy who, look, a guy who becomes a neurologist is clearly in his head, right? All right. So I was a left brain guy, extremely rational. I could watch the most dramatic movie that was heart centric and not shed a tear or not have any real feeling. And that's how I was. I grew up that way. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and that's the way guys were supposed to be. And with this technology, look, it works for sleep, but I don't think that's the greatest benefit here. I think,
The
yeah,
sleep is pretty good, though, I have to
yeah,
say.
it
That's
is.
kind of important.
Yeah, I love it for that. And people always call this a sleep device. And I go,
Yes.
no, you got it wrong. Number one, I think medically speaking, I think stress reduction is even more important than sleep. Okay. We know how many diseases that causes or worsens. And we know if you can dramatically reduce stress, your sleep's going to get better. I'm
Mhm.
not saying don't use it for sleep. I'm just saying if you had to choose one or the other, I would do stress. And I would do stress first to get that under control. But what you just did in terms of being able to feel that, when I started with this, no, I couldn't feel anything. What are you talking about? What do you mean vibration, tingling? Yeah, nothing. I was just so constrained. Now I can feel that tingling. I just have to think about it right now. Right, I can feel it throughout my entire body, every aspect of my body. I can feel it. And when I use the technology to feel it, it's dramatic. I mean, when I did my meditation session this morning, I mean, it was so intense.
Oh, I
All
have to
right.
try it with a meditation. I didn't think about that. But I'm
Yeah.
wondering about the people who do have anxiety, depression, PTSD. How does this device work for them?
Yeah. Well, before I answer that, okay, let me just tell you this. All right. When I watch a romantic or a dramatic movie now, I go through 20 tissues.
Really? But what, because your
Yes.
brain decided to pick up on emotions that you didn't have?
No, because if you start feeling more physically, it translates into feeling more emotionally.
Oh, okay.
Okay. They work in tandem because your entire feeling nature is enhanced.
Mhm.
And that's really key to understanding this technology. And again, that's more life changing than just sleeping better. All right.
Well,
Yeah,
you
I
haven't
sleep.
spoken to a menopausal woman yet. Then the sleep is pretty darn important, but it's because
No,
she's stressed too. That's part of the game. Okay, the hormones, but part of the
right.
game is we're stressed, and then you don't sleep, and that stresses you out more, and then the hormonal fluctuations are actually. Does the device impact our hormones?
Yeah.
Does how?
Remember, you're dealing with the reticular activating system, which sends fibers to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is the regulator for your hormones. And this even affects leptin and ghrelin on your gut, because remember, that's controlled by the area of the autonomic nervous system that has less attention paid to it. All right, the
That's your
enteric division.
appetite hormones. Just people
Right,
know what leptin and ghrelin is.
right. And ghrelin, produced by the stomach, says, "Hey, feed me." Time to eat. And leptin, produced by the fat cells in the abdomen, say, I got enough glucose coming in to turn into fat, stop eating. When you look at what the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system does, it sends fibers down there and it enhances leptin. All right. So you end up eating less and losing weight when leptin is activated. And what happened to me again, this took a couple of years. Okay. This doesn't happen overnight. But when my deep sleep was restored, and I moved into, and my feeling nature was enhanced so that I could feel this all day. And my level of relaxation was dramatic. And that persisted on a regular basis. So very little stress. All right. When that all occurred, I found myself putting the same amount of food on my plate. And then I would look and I couldn't eat more than half of it.
Oh,
So my
naturalism.
intake, yeah, yeah, my intake went down. And as a result, I had developed a little bit of a pot belly. I've never been heavy, but I ended up losing 25 pounds in a very short time period just because I was eating less, but I was satisfied and my pot belly went away. That was a nice side benefit. But again, it's because of increased activity of the parasympathetic division of the ANS.
So then, how long has the device been around the market?
It hasn't been around a long time. I like to work for a long time on getting things right before we release it. We entered what's called MVP mode, for minimum viable product, about 2.5 years ago. And a lot of people like to start selling product when you reach MVP mode, but I don't. I like to have test groups and I like to get it out to just a certain number of people, and so that we can refine it. I mean,
Yeah.
you asked about PTSD, for instance.
Yeah.
Okay. After we got it out about the first 50 units or so, it was working in most people, but there were a handful where it wasn't working. And I was really confused because my take on this was we're dealing with such a small part of the nervous system. Everybody should operate at about the same frequencies. And so I couldn't figure out why were these people not responding the way the other people were responding. So I put my white coat back on, went out and interviewed them, and they were hyper vigilant. I was sitting there, they were making me nervous because they were scanning the environment for potential danger, and we were sitting in a park, for God's sakes. And there was no reason to be nervous about anything. Wide open space, nobody was around us. And sure enough, after a couple meetings, they would tell me their history. And it was really sad because some of these people were very badly abused physically and emotionally, as starting in infancy for some of them. And so they were really bad cases of PTSD. And they'd been through every kind of therapy, and it didn't help. These people were in significant distress. Even after interviewing them, it still took me a little while to realize that we're not meeting these people where they're at, because they're not functioning at the same frequencies that people without PTSD normally operate at. And so I started to experiment with them, and just with stress sessions. And I said, let's lower the frequency closer to the sympathetic frequencies, because you're probably operating so far down towards the sympathetic range, or even maybe in it. Because again, they had to maintain that hypervigilant state like they're in stress just to allow them to feel more safe and secure.
Yeah.
Right. I wonder, for them, it's like, I want to see the danger coming. That's the only way I can feel safe, when I see no danger.
Yeah.
So they were scanning their environment. And so I said, I'm not getting close to where they need to be. So we did experiment after experiment, reducing the frequency until they finally go, oh, now I'm relaxed. And that's right. And that's what caused us to say, you know what? We need to create a calibration process to be able to meet people where they're at.
Oh, that's before you had the calibration. I see.
Yes. So we didn't realize we needed a calibration. You have to remember, we're developing something that is new. So every time we ran into an obstacle, we needed a new discovery. You couldn't go into a textbook and figure this out.
Mhm.
Nobody's ever done this before. Nobody has ever made a successful entrainment device, let alone figure out all these other things.
So if you were lowering the frequency to meet them where they're at, then how, and I'm assuming then the entrainment part will move them over to a safer place or a better frequency, more relaxed state so that they can live their lives without being so hyper vigilant. And I guess that takes months or years. Like how long does it take before you get someone to be in a different state of mind?
We don't know because you have to do a study to figure that out. And my guess is it's going to be a long-term study. But the point you're making is very real. And so we realized that the initial calibration process, which you're going through in the first 5 nights, it's sort of to zoom into a range that you're going to start feeling an effect. But then we have what's called auto res F, or the automatic resonant frequency that's going to match best with you. Every 12 days, well, not every 12 days, but every 2 days, we change the frequency back and forth to say, does she need an adjustment? And so we continue that every 12 days. We make a decision based on those prior 12 days. Should we tweak it a little this way or that way? And then we do another 12 days. So it's constantly looking to give you the best, because you could have something that changes in your life. I mean, menopause. Okay. We all of a sudden is like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm operating at a different level now. My nervous system is not the same. And so we need to know that. And I mean, we're not going to ask you. This has to be done automatically. So it's constantly looking for a change in your biometrics to say we have to either lower or increase her frequency. And we do this by determining your sleep quality. If your sleep quality is getting worse at one particular frequency, then we know we need to adjust it another way, the other way, and then keep testing that to see, does she need further adjustment, or she's recovered from that. Let's say it was just a traumatic event as opposed to menopause. Then we might have to adjust it temporarily and then move it back. So all of these things come into
How
play.
does it know? Yeah, it's so interesting. So it just knows you've created this amazing algorithm so that it knows and adjusts automatically. And you've been figuring this out over the years. The difference between, say, oh, somebody has an Oura ring in their whatever device, they're looking at their sleep scores. Okay, I know I shouldn't have drank that night, or I know I need to prioritize sleep and manage my stress. So you have to do something out there to come to this, to improve your scores. Whereas here, the device is actually kind of doing it for you, in the sense you still should do all the stuff that you need to do. But there's certain things like, I'm getting a second hip operation. This will be a great test because I have no control of that. My body's going to go under extreme trauma. I will have poor sleep for sure. So what this machine does will help guide me, and I'm assuming this is will I'll be the one to test, and it'll guide me into still a deeper sleep, which I need to recover and repair. It's not my fault that I've done. It's my fault I've chosen to do this, but it's probably worse in the long run if I don't do it in terms of staying chronic. But hopefully the Soltech will guide me, actually at least support me as best as it can, in addition to all the other things that I'm doing to try to get good sleep. There's only so much you can do if you've got a surgery or you're going through menopause, you're trying to figure out your hormones. And just the fact that knowing that the Soltech can help with your brain's activation of certain hormones. Perhaps that would be interesting to know if you were to take blood tests or any kind of hormone test to say, oh, is this actually supporting my hormones as crazy during the menopause? And maybe it's a little bit more stable. I don't know. We have to wait for more data to make some of these claims, but I'll certainly be testing it out for you.
There was one woman who we were doing some testing. Her husband was doing some testing for us. And this was in one of the very, very early prototypes. So this was a number of years ago. And her husband died, and she was grief stricken. And we taught her how to use it for relaxation. So she was using it for stress reduction during the period of grief. She was hypothyroid, and so she had been on thyroid replacement medications for years. I think like a couple decades, and she was stable. And next time she went into her doctor, they had to cut the dose in half.
Oh, interesting. Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
right. And
There's a,
so,
yeah.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
just whether that's the thing is the hormones. If you can manage the stress, we know there's already enough scientific data showing
right.
their hormones will be
Will
impacted.
change, right? Exactly. You're going to have a change in adrenaline. You're going to have a change in cortisol, and all the changes that happen as a result of those hormones.
So
So, yeah,
this is so what I love about the Soltec is that it's while I sleep, great. It's something I can use while I'm asleep, and I don't need to make an extra hour for it. I have been using it while I'm working or just sitting around. If I'm scrolling on my phone, I'm like, okay, let me just put on the Soltec and see what I feel in terms of relaxation. But it's nice that we can use something. There's something working for us while we're actually asleep, because it's not only the sleep architecture that it's trying to influence and help us get into deeper sleep, but it's also through the magnets is working on de-stressing us at the same time. Is that correct?
to be totally candid, I we started this business not to help people sleep.
Yeah, yeah,
we
you said
we
that.
started this business to reduce stress. We were really after, can we, my partner and I, literally, we put in $10 million to start with research. We named the company, we're doing business as Soltech Health. We named the business Round River Research Corporation because we knew that to try to solve this problem, it was going to be like navigating a round river.
You'll never get to the end.
And we're right, I have to keep going around and around and around. It took us 17 years to make our first discovery.
Wow. Yeah, that's
Right.
persistent.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we realized how to do it, it was like, okay, now that we're doing this, the same area of the nervous system affects sleep. So we said, all right, we might as well test sleep too, because it should affect it given what we're doing. you
Yeah.
know and it obviously it did, because the drivers for sleep are in that same part of the nervous system. Again, rest and digest, sleep, stress reduction, all from the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. But when it came right down to it, the stress was the first emphasis.
Mm. So just to wrap up on how this works, this is, I would say, the size of a skateboard. It's a little, let's say, use a device that you stick under the bed or at the foot of the bed, or if you're sitting at your office at your feet, you plug it into the wall, you wear the watch device, the wearable, and then this is the communication, the watch with the actual device or generator. And then through the generator, you have these magnetic frequencies that are sending these signals to, you said, about 3 or 4 feet out. And that's how it's able to affect your neurological function, actually, the brain architecture as well, to get you either in a deep sleep or to get you into a certain brain wave function in terms of de-stressing or relaxation. And then over time, you will see changes because the brain is plastic. It takes a while for the brain to get some change so that you are actually sleeping better or feeling less stressed or feeling more emotion or more connected, whatever it is you want. It sounds like a lot of other things that it can do as well. So did I understand that in a nutshell?
I think you did, but let me point out one thing, and you mentioned it, you touched on it, and that was, yeah, if you're sitting at your desk and you put this by your feet, then it's going to affect you. All right. Now, in the beginning, you may not notice it, but you will be less stressed. Okay. I tell people, hey, you know what? If you've got a problem with stress, first of all, focus on that just as much as sleep or even more. But you could be doing your emails and have this on. So it's almost like multitasking meditation,
Mm-hmm.
as dumb as that sounds, right?
Yeah.
And so you put it there. But remember how we touched on the feeling, okay, that tingling. You want to start learning what that feels like and allow that to move up your legs. And typically, by the time that feeling reaches your knees, even though your hands are far away from your knees, you start to feel it there because your receptivity in the hands is so great. All right. And then ultimately, you can get to feel it throughout your body. And different people, it's going to take different amounts of time. And I remember one woman I was working with, she said, it's moved up my legs. And for some reason, it's stopping at my pelvic area. And I said, all right, have you had any kinds of surgery or trauma? And she says, well, she said, I had 3 C-sections and a hysterectomy. And I
Um,
said, oh, okay. It took her another month before she could feel in that area because it was a block.
oh, interesting. And then the frequencies
And
unblocked
then she could ultimately,
eventually, right?
right, she ultimately could feel it throughout her body. But there was a block in that area. So if there's been a surgery in a particular area or an emotional block attached to a particular area or any kind of trauma, then yeah, all of these things work this way. But ultimately, so let's say I were to use this right now. Okay. And I'm not using it right now. But if I were to use this right now and I was doing work, I would like every few minutes, I might say, what am I feeling? How am I? And intensify that. And so in that way, you accelerate the process of enhancing that sensation throughout the body and further relaxing. And when you do that, I do my meditations when I get up, that effect lasts all day long. So I'm much more calm, relaxed, less, I get triggered much less. I'm less reactive. I'm a better person because I do this.
Oh, I love it. Well, I'm super excited to keep trying and keep going and wait for this calibration to end. And then I've already feeling it's quite amazing the how quickly I fall asleep again without even having too much trouble in the beginning anyways. So I will see how things go on and I'll be reporting back to everybody with my results and yeah, experience with this. I think it's quite amazing what it can do. And it's so different. It's different, completely different. It's not just monitoring and measuring things. It's actually rejuvenating, reviving, and putting us into a better space. And we're putting our brain into a better space. So it's like a 2-for-1 thing. And there is a holiday sale going on right now. It's $800 off the
Yeah.
Soltech system.
Yeah.
And
Right now. Yeah.
you got to go to soltechhealth.com/buy now, and you get an extra $100 off with the code ZORA, ZORA. And I'll have links to that in the show notes, as well as links to your Facebook and Instagram. And you're sharing all kinds of really interesting information. And I'm super excited. I learned about this device through my biohacking bestie, Natalie Nidham, and I've just been raving about it too. So I'm glad that I get a chance to test this out. Is there anything else that we've missed, we haven't covered that you'd like to still share before I let you go?
No, I would just emphasize when you report back to the people that follow you, keep giving them information about how the feeling nature is enhanced and not only physically, but emotionally,
Oh,
because I
okay.
think that's really important. And only other thing I would say is bed partners also get some effect, but because we personalize the stimulus for the user will get much more effect than the bed partner. But there's usually enough overlap in terms of sleep stages, and they might be reasonably close to the frequency range for that individual that they'll also have some benefit, which is nice.
Oh, nice. All right. That's really good to know. That's good to know. So we'll see. I'll test it out. My husband's away for now, but when he comes back, I'll have to see.
One other thing that's also important to know, or actually two, you're a quick responder. All right. A lot of people aren't. So you have to be patient and you have to cultivate and do the relaxation exercises so you can feel it. Then you'll know it's starting to work. Okay.
Mm,
That's one thing. The the other thing is based on age. It's once you start getting so that you're sleeping better and you're less stressed, try to become more active because that will further accelerate the deep sleep. Get the body moving. And because everybody has a tendency, not everybody, but the vast majority of people, as you get older, you're more sedentary, you're less active. And that activity, you'll see it in your scores. It really makes a difference combined with this technology. So I'm a big advocate of exercise of any type, but without overdoing it and hurting yourself. But you know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I can't wait to get both my hips working again and then see my scores just shoot through the roof. I'm so grateful you shared so much about the brain, about stress, about sleep. It's been so interesting to speak with you. And I'm just so grateful that I get a chance to try this. And I look forward to signing in with my results. And we'll definitely have another chat.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Take care.